Welcome to Great Coffee
Right. Hey, how's it going?
Hello.
So, welcome to the next round. You said you had a busy week this week, Dom.
Yeah, it was very busy. We've got various things happening. I was just saying we had the Catholic Review office coming to St. Paul, so getting grilled for my RE lessons is always fun.
Wow.
And plenty going on. What about you guys?
This is the last week that we're open to the students at Newman Hall. Tomorrow is the last day after 60-something years.
Oh my
at
gosh.
Newman Hall.
I can't even believe
End of an era, right?
the room next door was where I met Laura
Oh, wow.
and most of you guys.
I was just over with my dad yesterday, and he said it was in his second year here at Auckland University that the chaplaincy moved into this building.
All
My
right.
dad's 78 years old. So
Oh.
my gosh.
Anyway, that is crazy.
Yeah,
It's
so we're having an epic games night tonight, just to
Mm.
kind of a send-off, and so we just decorate all the front room, we bake some cake, it's going to be fantastic.
Wonderful. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yes.
So this is episode 2 of our 3-part series, Is the Catholic Church Homophobic? And today we have a very special guest, our very own Father Christiana. So last week we had, 2 weeks ago we had Brendan Malone, the infamous, on to talk about the lay church's perspective on that question, is the Catholic Church homophobic? And I think he addressed a couple of things. So the first thing was really that word homophobic and how it's been kind of used as a tool for I guess a lot of the gay community. We also talked about that. To I guess label people who don't agree with homosexuality as bigots, you know. And essentially people are not truly homophobic most of the time. They don't have an irrational fear of
Yes.
homosexuals, but that's the way it comes across. I think he also talked about, because I asked the question, what is it exactly that the lay church needs to do to be more welcoming? And he was kind of along the lines of, well, they don't necessarily need to do anything different. Like we should be treating homosexuals differently to other people.
Yeah.
So we were hoping for your perspective on the pastoral side of things. I mean, how do we even go about that?
I'd like to pick up on that point that Brendan put there and say, yeah, absolutely, we should not be treating them any differently. One of the issues I think that we do have to face up to is the fact that to a certain extent in recent times we have, and that homosexually attracted people do have grounds to be a bit grumpy about the fact that they can feel picked on, and a certain amount of justice to that. After all, when was the last time you heard anybody in the church getting stuck into heterosexual misbehaviour?
Right.
Except in some very specific accounts. There's an issue. It could be quite possible for someone who has same-sex attraction to feel, okay, there's my mate who's shacked up with his girlfriend, and I know he's sleeping with her every night, and no one's saying anything about that, but they're picking on me. And that's a fair point.
Yeah, it's true. So like what you're saying is like it's more, we need to be actually looking more at ourselves rather than looking at other people.
Exactly, and also as that point that Brendan made about treating everybody equally. And the core of that is recognising that for all of us, whatever our sexual attractions, whatever any part of our life, we're all called to the same thing, holiness. Francis has just had something to say about that. It is one of the great themes of the Second Vatican Council, the universal call to holiness. Holiness isn't something that's reserved for people like Mother Teresa, it's every Christian's calling. We're all called to be holy. Our lives, all of us, are meant to be holy. And that means all of us, not just people with same-sex attraction, need to be putting our lives under that sort of microscope. And maybe we have got a bit lax about that. So if we're being unfair there, well, should we be being lax with everything now? Or should we be taking this as an opportunity for all of us to look and say, yeah, there's a time for us to recommit ourselves, all of us,
Mm-hmm.
whatever our state in life, whatever our attractions, whatever our desires, to live the sort of life that God is calling us to.
I'm wondering about how this pans out practically, because I know there are certain circumstances, or I'm guessing there are certain circumstances under which you would not give somebody communion, for instance, or let them partake in the sacrament, certain sacraments. So I think I remember having a conversation last time we talked about how if somebody was coming into church with like this gay pride shirt, it was like anti Catholic shirt on, then you wouldn't give them the body and blood of Christ, because it wouldn't be appropriate, and because what they're wearing and saying is directly against the church and her beliefs. But how do we, because we talked about that double standard before, where you know that there's a girlfriend and boyfriend are probably cohabitating, and it's not like they just have separate rooms. And so, but with homosexuals who attend mass regularly, like how does the church approach that? Because as you said, we're called to not treat them any differently. But like, what's the solution? Is it to refuse and ask all young couples who may be cohabitating, or is it to try to?
Well, basically, exactly to treat them the same, and that's precisely why I may have someone in my congregation that I know is attracted to people of the same sex, and potentially having relations with them. If they present themselves for communion, I'm going to give them communion, because who am I to say they haven't been to confession yesterday, and so forth. The point about the person who turns up wearing, as people have in the past, it seems to not be a thing at the moment, I'm happy to say, wearing a great big rainbow sash, is they'll be refused precisely because they're making a statement which is contrary to the church teaching, and sort of waving that flag, if you like, as you come up the aisle. And going to communion is not meant to be a political act. So by definition, they're not coming with the right disposition. Now, would I refuse a heterosexual person who's living in sin, if you like, communion? Well, on pretty much the same grounds as I would someone homosexually attracted. That is to say, if somebody in the community is married, known to be such, been there in the parish, and then leaves his wife and publicly shacks up with another woman, and they come to Mass, well, that's a very public statement. That's public scandal, and that's an issue. And that's the sort of thing where if I see them doing that, I'm probably going to have a word and say, look, you've done this. I can't give you communion if you come up. So be aware that's going to happen. But that's a very different thing from, if you like, ordinary everyday failure. Because I have to trust that people are going to come to communion properly disposed and having made themselves ready. That's up to their conscience in the end. It's not for me to look, because I don't have the ability to read people's souls. I don't know, and there's no little sign over people's head, I just went to confession, or I haven't been anywhere near the sacrament of penance for the last 15 years. I've got no indication of that. And so the communion line isn't the place for me to be making that judgment. Now, if someone comes to talk to me about something, I can advise them. And I will advise them to do what I think is in their best interests. But that's going to be dependent on the situation. And this is the sort of thing we're talking about. Somebody who is very definitely struggling with any sort of major sexual temptation and failing frequently in that regard, well, I'm there to support them, to help them, not to condemn them. I'm there trying to get them to live that life that God's calling them to. And there's no distinction there as to what exactly the problem is. And that's, it would be a good opportunity there, I think, to pick on another term that people have a certain amount of difficulty with, which is the church's teaching that homosexual attraction is intrinsically disordered. And again, the problem, I suspect, is that people think that that's a very specific condemnation just of homosexual attraction in comparison. Whereas in fact, I would suggest the vast majority of Christians have disordered sexual attractions.
Okay.
It's no great surprise that that would be the case. After all, what are the two greatest drives we have as living beings? To survive and to reproduce. No surprise that those two drives are where most of our problems are in terms of violence or greed for our desire to survive, and of course problems with our sexuality, dealing with that great drive for reproduction. Our strongest drives, of course, are affected by the fall. And so most of us have nooks and crannies in our sexual lives that probably we're not too comfortable with, and rightly so. That's true of a whole range of things. That doesn't mean that that's just particular to one group of people.
Right.
And that's again a point we need to make, to recognise that all of us need purification. All of us have desires that we simply can't properly act on and call ourselves followers of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Well, would you agree with the statement, like saying that the Catholic Church actually doesn't have any hang-ups about homosexual people? So
Absolutely.
there's nothing wrong with gay people.
There is nothing at all wrong with having a particular sexual orientation or particular sexual desires. As I say, they are, the fact that even if some of them are disordered, that's a consequence of the fall. It's a part of the common heritage of humanity, that we all have parts of our lives that are a struggle, that are a temptation. Being tempted is not sinful. Jesus was tempted, as we hear in the scriptures, in every way that we are, but did not sin. There is the point. There's the difference for each of us. We are, all of us, tempted. The fact that we're tempted is not a wrong on our part. It's what we do when we're tempted that might be.
And my follow-up to that is that on our last video we had a few people watching who commented, and the first comment, it was very much like, we talk a lot about, well, it's okay as long as you're not acting like actually living out your desires. So but they said, oh well, all scary homosexuals who are actually active homosexuals, and how obviously we're showing some kind of bias there. And I guess my question is, in terms of overcoming the obstacles in the church, I think a lot of people would see homosexual love as illegitimate, not just disordered. But they would say, well, you think you're in love, but you're not, because two people of the same sex can't be in love. But I mean, what theologically is the view on that? Like, is homosexual love somehow modelled on true love, the love of God, or somehow,
Of course, all love in the end is of God. It's perfectly possible to be in love with someone of the same sex. Plenty of people, even those whose actual orientation is not necessarily to the same sex, can be. And that's not a statement, by the way, that they are bisexual either. Love, again, both in the sense of the passion, the desire for another, well, that can be, you can have that for all sorts of people, who just once you walk by, once you meet, and then you can have that desire. But then also there is the true deeper meaning of love, which is desiring the good of the other. That which is what love at its heart really is. And not only can one have that for people of the same sex, you ought to. I'm certainly supposed to desire your good, both of you, passionately, in fact. And so, yes, it's perfectly possible to have love for someone of the same sex. Very powerful, and also to have desire for another, and for that not to be sinful. It's merely the expression of that that can be. In the end, it comes down to acts, what we do. And that's just as true for heterosexuals as it is for homosexuals. The fact, if I am a married man and I suddenly find myself with deep, powerful desire for this lovely co-worker at my place of work, well, yes, to act on that is clearly going to be wrong. But that doesn't mean that my desire for her is not genuine, and that hopefully also my desire for her good is not also genuine. So, and that's why you have, and some very wonderful people who would live this testimony out in their everyday lives.
Right.
People who are same-sex attracted, who have lived practicing, if you want to use that term, that for some years, and then come to realize that's wrong and stop, but continue to live with the person whom they've had that relationship with, continue to care for them, continue in fact to love them, just without that sexual component, recognizing that this is not right, this is not what we're called to, but that doesn't change my care for you and the fact that I want to love you. Very proper.
Certainly, because the next one will be with a friend of mine who has a long-term boyfriend, and you know, they've been living together, and he was saying that, well, you know, we have a very loving and caring relationship, and I don't want to speak too much for him, but I think I guess all I'd say is, like, you know, could you then comment on the thing that would say, well, if I have these feelings, then God has created me this way. God has created me with an erotic same-sex attraction.
Well, the immediate refutation of that, of course, is that, as science will tell you, an awful lot of our drives and desires are innate. If you like, you could argue that's the way I'm made. And that includes things that we inherit, or there's a strong hereditary part to them, like being predisposed to violence. And so can someone who is predisposed to violence say, well, that's the way God made me, that's okay? And of course the answer is no. If we look, all of us have those things in us that are not ordered towards what God is calling us to. Yes, that's the way we are made. It's not the way we're meant to be. If I could take the opportunity to leap in here with one of my pet hates, which gets some people riled up, the hymn, Come As You Are, which is in general quite a nice hymn, except that first line to it, come as you are, that's how I want you, which of course is flat wrong. Now, the way the hymn was written, of course, the meaning there is meant to be, this is the way God desires us. It's an interesting point. But we tend to take it, or it's very easy to in modern English, to say that's the way we ought to be in God's eyes. And of course that's not the case. Each and every one of us, the two Dominics here, myself, Pope Francis, Bishop Pat, are all called to repent, to turn to God. That's the call for all of us. And of course that's just another way of saying we're called to be holy. And that means leaving aside or not acting on a number of our desires and drives. Anybody who knows me well will know that I've got a bit of a temper and that it can end in lashing out a bit when I get really cross. Can I argue that's the way God made me? That's okay? No, I can't. That's actually something that I need, with God's grace, to try to overcome if I'm going to live the life that I have. So yes, I'm afraid that's the way I'm made, that's the way God made me. That would be true if there'd never been a fall. But there has. Human nature is wounded by the fall. No surprise then that most of our drives are also wounded for each and every one of us. And dealing with that, letting God's grace work in us to deal with that, more to the point, is a big part of being a Christian.
So yeah, kind of to sum up a bit, we've talked about how the struggle we have is a human one, and we're all called to turn to God in a way that's maybe contrary to what would be natural to us in some cases, if you're naturally inclined to violence, or in the case of being same-sex attracted. But so maybe that there's a higher calling that as humans, we're all called to turn to God, and every time we make a mistake, repent and convert.
Exactly. And for most of us, that's a lifelong process of keeping on going, doing that, failing, getting up, asking for God's grace and mercy again, trying again. That's not going to be any different for anybody who's same-sex attracted. And to look at someone who keeps trying, keeps failing in that respect, and to condemn them for that, well, you might as well condemn me for my failures repeatedly of temper or the other habitual failures that I suffer from, and indeed that everybody suffers from. Each of us has our own weakness that's a big part of our lives, or weaknesses for some of us. No surprise that that's a struggle that we find very difficult. It's just different for each of us.
There's also that authentic love of that, willing the good of the other, which nothing wrong doing that for someone of the same sex. In fact, it's perfectly right.
It's obligatory.
Yeah. It's just doing it in the correct way.
Exactly. And that's very much the way, realizing that, yes, that's actually for all of us, whatever our sexual attraction is, a big part of our life is discovering how to love a very large number of people when, in fact, if it comes to the sexual expression of that love, maximum one of those that we're supposed to actually be doing that with. So if that becomes, and this is a great problem in our society today, that we do make love all about sex, because in the Christian understanding, that means we're only going to love one person. And that's very, very mistaken. We're called to love everybody, and that doesn't mean we're called to have sex with everybody. So,
you hit it here first.
So, therefore, understanding that, yes, my call to love and to let my drives be a part of that, in the very fact that I am attracted to some people is actually going to make it easier in some ways for me to love them properly. It's going to call me more powerfully to seek their good, and so I can embrace that, but there are the proper means to do it.
Right.
And that's, for all of us, is our calling.
I'm really looking forward to relaying this, getting our next guest on, and just to talk about, how does the gay community, or people who have a homosexual attraction, how do they take that Well, how do people, heterosexual people as well, anyone, how do we take that understanding of our sexuality, and what does that really mean, because essentially for a lot of people you're saying, well, that's fine, it's fine to have those feelings, you can just never ever act on them. And I'm sure that's not easy to hear.
And I'm sure it most certainly is not. But it's a part of actually the calling of quite a lot of humanity. There's an unfortunate feeling that you see in many people these days that if I'm not sexually active, I can't possibly be fulfilled as a human being. Well, excuse me, I'm going to put my hand up and say, my personal experience, nonsense, and there's an awful lot of people out there who could do the same. It's not, and that doesn't mean that my sexuality has to be completely suppressed. It's not, it can't be, after all, it's an inherent part of me. It means that it's simply not expressed in certain ways, and I need to find the ways that it can be expressed for the good of myself and others. And that's a basic thing for all human beings, whatever their attraction.
Also, we need more priests.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That'll be another podcast.
There would be, Any last questions or comments?
No, I think it's been put in a very good way. I mean, obviously this is a conversation that could go on forever,
It could.
and hopefully it does. So yeah, guys, you keep on the conversation, and if you have any questions you would like us to talk about in the next podcast or in future podcasts, just put them in the comments below.
Definitely.
And let us know what you guys think. So thank you very much, Father Chris, for being on the podcast with us.
Thank you for inviting me on.
Yeah, and thank you for watching.
Kia ora.
God bless.
Good.
Hey guys, thanks for watching the podcast. I've got good news. It just got a whole lot easier to search for us online.
All you gotta do is search Gregorian Chat into YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, iTunes, and Player FM for those who are on Android.
Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. See you later. God bless.